Okay, so my name's Stephanie Robertson. For those of you who I haven't met yet, and I'm here with three people. And you know, it's funny because Louise will tease me for saying this, but I actually love this conversation. And so I'm here with three people who I'm going to actually ask to introduce themselves. We're going to talk about contracting and procurement, and excuse me, how they can change and evolve. Uh, could I ask you first, Tim, to introduce yourself, and then we'll go to Tabatha and then to Louise. Could you tell us about yourself, your organization, and a little bit about your role, what you do?
Sure, certainly, Stephanie. And hello, thank you for having me here. Um, so, as you've gathered, I'm Tim Cummins. I am the president of an organization. If you are familiar with us, you quite possibly know us as IECCM, the International Association for Contract and Commercial Management. Though actually, just a couple of weeks ago, we rebranded and we're now World Commerce and Contracting, still fulfilling the same underpinning mission as we have fulfilled in the 21 years of our existence, but supplementing that quite considerably with far more advocacy, the development of standards, and really building on our previous commitment to extensive research with even more extensive research. I founded the association about 21 years ago. Today we've grown to a point where we're at about 72,000 members around the world, representing over 20,000 different organizations, and present in about 180 countries. Very diverse membership, a mixture of people who are managing commercial activity from both a buy side and a supply side. Our ethos as an organization is we want better business, better society, and we believe that contracting, commercial management, and related practices are really fundamental to building greater fairness, greater inclusivity, as well as delivering better business results. At a personal level, actually, I stepped down from being the CEO of the organization a couple of years ago, but did managed to avoid stepping into a steady drift towards retirement because I was then actually appointed as a professor at the University of Leeds, where I am teaching in the law school, which again is slightly ironic because I've never actually undertaken any legal training. So that in a nutshell perhaps depicts my rather curious life.
But you've obviously never broken the law either. Is that right, Tim? I don't know. I hate to make assumptions, but Tabatha, would you mind introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about your role at the association?
Sure. So Ani, Tabatha, Indigenakas, Nipissing, Diginabad, Majisi Dodem. So hello everyone. My name is Tabatha Bull. I am from the community of Nipissing First Nation. I am a Anishinaabe in Canada, and our totem is the eagle. So it's traditional often for us to introduce ourselves in our home language, which I am relearning or starting to learn again. So thank you all for having me. I am the president and CEO of the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business. We have been around for about 35 years. Originally, the purpose was to bring together Indigenous and non-Indigenous businesses to help corporate Canada open their networks and be able to help support the Indigenous economy in Canada. We have a number of different programs. And so we're a membership association. We have close to 1,100 members from large major banks, large major oil producers, Suncor, many international organizations. About 45% are non-Indigenous businesses, and then 55% are Indigenous businesses across every province and territory in Canada in every sector and size. So I know there was a panel just prior to this that was really talking about the Indigenous economy in Canada and the significant growth we're seeing there. So that's really what we're here to do. We have a couple of different programs, as I said, but one program that we launched about 3 years ago is called Supply Change, and its particular focus is on increasing supply and purchasing from Indigenous businesses in Canada. So we have a program, procurement marketplace, that we have about 70 procurement champions, corporate leaders, Indigenous and non, that have made a commitment to buy from certified Indigenous businesses. So the purpose of that is to really connect those businesses with large buyers. And we also are advocating very strongly for the Government of Canada to make a similar commitment as well to purchase from Indigenous businesses. My background is actually, I'm an electrical engineer, and prior to coming to CCAB, I worked on renewable energy projects with First Nation and Métis communities in the province of Ontario. So looking at how we could incent those builders to contract and partner with Indigenous communities on renewable projects. So happy to bring that voice to the discussion. I'm always eager to use my engineering nerdy brain to go back to talk about energy. So really pleased to be here. Miigwech.
Louise, would you mind introducing everyone to yourself?
Hi everyone, I'm Louise Townsend. I'm head of social value and sustainability for a company called Morgan Sindall. Morgan Sindall is a privately owned company in the UK. We operate only in the UK. We are probably in the top 3 companies in the country, so we turn over just over £3 billion a year. But we're unique in that others who turn over similar amounts also, you know, they work overseas too. So we elected not to. We think there's enough to go for in the UK. We don't need to go anywhere else in the world. I've been with the business since 2008 and have had various roles since I've been in the business. I think probably the reason, when I started in the construction industry about 20 some years ago, I was astonished at how the contractor got the blame for everything. Absolutely everything. It was the contractor's fault that the roads were dirty. It was the contractor's fault that the electricity didn't work at the right time. It was the contractor's fault that everything to do with everything that construction does, it was always the contractor's fault, which felt a little unfair. So the reason for telling you that is because I've spent really most of my career trying to make people understand that actually a good construction business is good business. And just because you have the purpose of making money doesn't mean that you can't enrich the lives of your other stakeholders at the same time. And so probably for particularly the last 8 years, I've spent shaping structures and policies and strategies and challenging our internal status quo and some of our external status quo as well, to look at some of the procedures and things that have always been considered to be the norm, and saying, well, just because it feels like the norm, does it mean it's the best way of doing it? So I find myself here today talking about some of that experience, really, because it is really important, I think, particularly at the moment going forward, that actually just because people keep talking about going back to normal, and actually I don't really know what normal is, and I'm not sure that the normal that we had is the right normal for us to move on to. And I think that now is an opportunity for us to challenge some of that stuff that we think is what we're seeking to go back to, and think, well, actually, let's go back or let's go forwards to something better than what we had before, and let's learn from what we thought was normal in the past. So.
Well, that's great. That's thank you all. I'm really looking forward to picking your brains over the next 45 minutes or so. So the title of our conversation today, which, what I've learned, especially over the last day and a half, is when you take the risk of engaging with people's brains, the title means nothing. So who knows where we'll go, and I'm okay with that. But the title we're going to start with is why contracts matter and why they need to change. And so why they need to change implies there's a problem. And so maybe we could talk about what the problem is. And Tim, would you give us your insights or your thinking around what some of the problems are with the way that we contract and we set up to procure, and what's the cause of those? Help us with a little bit of context around our conversation today.
So from my perspective, contracts are full of data. They're full of obligations and commitments and responsibilities. And the problem is that by and large, they are completely ineffective at communicating with any normal human being. So we are creating supposedly a framework to a relationship, yet doing it in such a way that for the recipient it is often difficult or impossible to understand. And I think that is a serious deficiency in any business relationship, but it is, of course, I think much more than a deficiency. It is in many ways a major abdication of responsibility to try to operate in that way with social enterprises, or, when we are after social value. Contracts today, and indeed the bidding process that surrounds them, is far too often an unfriendly, intimidating, and off-putting experience.
Tabatha, in your work, would you say that the process around procurement and contracting is flawed? And what does that look like from your perspective?
Yeah, I think, procurement and contracting is fair and transparent as we and organizations try to make it be. There's still inherent bias in almost everyone's process. And there's still a need to be part of the network or be in the know in some way. Even to have a heads up about when a potential contract is coming, that really does put people that are, more connected at an advantage, because they're more readily able to prepare for maybe a large RFP that comes out. But also, you sit around the table and think, well, who might be able to do this? And you go to all the same people that you've already worked with before. So if you're not part of that network, if you're a new business, how are you breaking into that? Unless there's a particular commitment to look for diverse suppliers, in our case, or a particular effort around building some type of new trust and relationship with new suppliers. So if we look at large infrastructure projects in Canada as an example, when a proponent may go to a First Nation community because the project is near their land and say, well, we want to partner now. Now the speed at which they want to do that is very short when they need those decisions made, when them as an organization may have been thinking about this project for a year before they've approached the community or the partner. So we need to start those relationships much earlier in order for us to get to a real strong relationship and have those partnerships go together in contracting. And in procurement, we've really seen that we need companies and governments to set targets around how much percentage they're going to be spending on diverse suppliers, and then to be measuring against that. There are some companies out there who want to do it because it's the right thing, but we need to be mandating and setting metrics around that in order to really make a big difference.
Louise, what do you think when you think about the problems that might exist in contracting? Is the problem that the contractor is always wrong? That's what you mentioned. It's always somebody else's fault. Or is there something else that you would add to that? or maybe describe that in a little bit more detail from where you sit.
Yeah, it's quite interesting actually, and I was just thinking as Tabatha was talking that actually, quite often the procurement activity is quite wholesome, and the intent of the procurement is actually really well intended, but actually through the delivery of the contract, that just disappears. So you buy one thing, or you're encouraged to offer one service offering, and then as soon as it comes to contract delivery, all of those things that you promised just kind of get forgotten. There's no penalty, there's no reward for performing or not in areas that aren't traditionally seen as critical to the delivery of the project, which is why I think it's, particularly in the UK, what's happening with the Social Value Act and its hardening. Just last week the government announced that there was going to be a further hardening of the Social Value Act in all central government procurement to address things like inequality and the climate emergency. And that's brilliant at procurement if you can do that, because it provides the service provider with an opportunity to actually stretch themselves and think differently, which is what we all need. But then if you win it on one basis and then as soon as you come down to contract delivery, it's back to business as usual, then there's no point changing the procurement. So I think, one of the things around contract, the way that contracts need to change is that there is a greater risk and reward and punitive mechanism within that for delivering the things that you've promised you're going to deliver. Because if we take it as read that if you're going to increase your supply chain's diversity by including Indigenous businesses or minority-owned businesses or whatever, and then you're not held to account for that, then it completely destroys the purpose of a wholesome procurement activity. I think I've forgotten the actual question. I was kind of responding to what Rebecca was saying. Sorry.
No, it's all good. I think that was it was helpful. And so what do we do about, how do we address those problems? Or maybe we should start recognizing that those problems that you have spoken to exist. What is the impact on the process and the experience of suppliers as a result? Tim, to your point, in that lack of a good relationship, or when that lack of trust or confidence exists in the partnership, what's the impact on the supplier? What's the impact on the company? And maybe you could offer some examples of that impact.
Yeah, I think the issue of trust that you've just raised is so fundamental to this conversation. We are, to varying degrees, as we look at social value and social inclusion, dealing with communities that perhaps have limited traditional trust in government or indeed in big business. So the importance of the nature of our outreach and the building of confidence is so important, and certainly a critical element of building greater trust is down to the quality of communication. We're doing some interesting work. Louise, you mentioned energy projects, and we're quite involved at the moment with an initiative that is looking at community engagement in energy projects in energy-starved areas, for example, rural India, where the lack of energy is debilitating to really what those local communities can do or achieve, or how much meaningful investment there can ever be. Yet many of those communities actually oppose energy projects because they're suspicious of the people who are bringing them to them. So how do we then begin to engage to build trust? Well, the research clearly in that case is showing that a lot of it comes down to the quality of communication. It's about early engagement and inclusiveness, which Tabatha was touching on. It's making people feel that they are respected and included. Now, this is where we come back, I think, to the form that communication takes. And I know you and I have discussed before, Stephanie, some of the exciting examples of where simple initiatives can begin to turn things around. And I think we've talked before about the use, for instance, of what are now increasingly termed comic contracts. And that isn't meant in a disparaging form, but it's a recognition that in many of the environments that we're dealing with, not only, of course, very few native tribes or socially disadvantaged communities, they certainly aren't abundant in the number of people with law degrees. And indeed, in many cases, you may be dealing with populations that are semi-literate. So providing them with bidding documentation that follows the normal form, and in one instance where we were looking at a 75-page employment agreement written in legalese, is, to be honest, is disrespectful. It shows that a complete absence of understanding. And in those instances where organizations have begun to turn towards much more intelligible agreements, a great example in Canada, which you may be aware of, Tabatha, was work that Nexen did around simplification of its procurement processes and inclusivity. And this, there is some fascinating and really heartwarming videos of individuals who have received these comic contracts and feel for the first time ever that actually they are respected as people. But not only that, of course, it's the fantastic benefit it also brings to the employer or the contractor, because very often we hear these issues from bigger business or from government that says, well, yeah, we try to do social inclusion, but the trouble is that they're not compliant, they don't meet the health and safety standards, they ignore all the rules. And we don't turn around and say, is that because they don't want to meet the rules, or is it because they don't actually understand what the rules are? We're doing some early work at the moment here in the UK around the BAME community and the consequences of COVID-19, which disproportionately affected particularly health workers from that same community. And again, it turns out that very often, yes, they weren't following the health and safety rules that were being put forward to help them to avoid the implications of COVID-19. It wasn't because they were willfully putting themselves at risk. It was because the way that those rules were being communicated were not, in their context, intelligible. So this is, I think, such a critical area where the quality and nature of our communication needs to be inclusive and respectful of the recipient, not the giver.
Tabatha, have you seen evidence of that opportunity or that challenge in Canada? Is that something that the CCAB is concerned with, I suppose? Is there a Canadian version to some of the things that Tim has touched upon?
So I think if I go back to my energy days, one thing that we really did find was capacity, like building the capacity, just as Tim's saying, of communities to understand the energy options. So in Canada, in Ontario alone, we have 25 communities that are on diesel generation. So remote fly-in communities that are still powered by diesel only, which presents a number of challenges. Just the risk of flying the diesel in if the winter roads are not suitable long enough. With climate change, that's definitely been an issue. So working with those communities on helping them understand the different options to them through renewable energy, but also working with the elders to help understand, if we put a run-of-the-river project in, not to get too technical, but how is that going to impact the fish and the livelihood? So completely on the need to really be able to fund the capacity discussions initially. So both to build up the capacity around different energy options. And this is something that the province of Ontario supported. So we had two programs. One was to support an energy assessment and a community energy plan in all First Nation communities across Ontario, and also to support what would be a community energy champion. So to be able to train someone within their community to really understand different energy options so that they could be a more fulsome part of those discussions. The other thing that we found was really, to me, it was such a great accomplishment, but at the initial time of trying to build renewable energy in Ontario as we moved off of coal, we had a number of different iterations of procurement opportunities for renewable energy. And at the very beginning, there wasn't very many First Nation partnerships. And by the time we got to the end of the program, the final large procurement, 13 of the 16 contracts had a First Nation that was partnered on a project. And then the project ended. So now we have all of these communities who are ready and able and want to be part of a project and want to be partnered, ready, and then your procurement is over. So we need to be doing that capacity building much earlier in the process before you start. And this procurement process went on for probably 7 to 8 years. So we need to be doing that capacity building earlier on to ensure that we have the right type of partnerships. But it did work. We just, there's lots of learnings that we could take from that. And then I think on procurement, regular procurement and supply chain, we are seeing some real successful opportunities from organizations who have made that commitment, and to buy from Indigenous businesses. And that's also the opportunities to close the loop when a project when you're not successful in a contract. So we see a lot of opportunity when the procurement officer goes back and meets with the business and explains to them why they weren't successful. Because sometimes it's really just that language that you use, or, you know, just the words that you use that catch the eye of certain procurement officers. And until we train new suppliers in that type of language, we're not going to be able to move as far forward. So that's been really successful as well.
So Louise, in your work, I mean, do you see the need to build capacity amongst your supply chain, or to communicate differently with your supply chain? Is that the responsibility of the individual company, and wouldn't that just be the risk of being perceived as a cost? Or is that, you know, how do you tackle that reality in your own, you know, Morgan Sindall context in your country, or do you? Is that prioritized?
Yeah, we didn't know we do. We absolutely do. The reasons for that are probably threefold. The first reason is because very often, one thing that I didn't say when I introduced myself is that between 70 and 80% of everything that we do is public sector. So we have to respond in the right way to public sector procurement to have any chance of winning work, is the reality. Probably for the last 6 or 7 years, there's been quite a big supply chain capacity building program going on certainly in big government procurements, and very gradually that's filtering down to local government level too. So the first reason is because, you know, we have to do that because we're encouraged to do it by the people who buy services from us. The second reason for doing it really is that it increases our resilience. You know, if we have all our eggs in one supplier's basket and that supplier fails us, then the whole project fails. If we've got one package spread across 5 smaller suppliers rather than one big supplier, and one of those 5 suppliers fails, then the other 4 can pick up the slack. So it just builds our resilience, and it creates competition and innovation within our own supply chain. Excuse me. And I think the third reason why we have quite a big program of capacity building for particularly micro businesses and social enterprises and minority-owned businesses is because it's the right thing to do. You know, we're all individuals outside of the corporate hat that we take to work every day. We're all individuals that come from diverse backgrounds, and you know, much of the supply chain community that we engage with now are reflective of ourselves, and it just feels more comfortable. So why wouldn't you do that? So those 3 things really are the driving force behind it. And what we so at the beginning of the year, we, as I've said just now, you know, we are driven partly by procurement to do this, but actually one of the things that I mentioned previously is that it's very difficult to be held to account on stuff like this because it is, you know, they're very complex contracts, and quite often, you know, you're not talking about a first or second tier supply chain partner. You might be talking third, fourth or fifth supply chain partner. So actually, how diverse is the supply chain once you start delving into it? So one of the things that we have created is something called Work Radar, which is a web-based platform that enables people who aren't currently part of our supply chain to ask to be involved in our supply chain within a certain postcode area. So that supply chain partner will register his interest in B45, which is a postcode in Birmingham. And then as and when we have a project in that area, that work opportunity will get pushed to that minority owned supply chain partner. We then will buddy up that minority owned, that micro business with a mainstream supply chain partner so that they can build each other's capacity, because there's, you know, not everybody knows everything. And I think it's quite easy in big business to think that you've learned everything there is to learn and you just know it all. But actually, you know, we learn daily from smaller suppliers who just are more agile. You know, they don't have the fat in the business that bigger companies do, so they just survive in a different way. So we've learnt from them, and I think our tier one contracting companies are learning from those businesses all the time, because there's always a different way to do something. You know, just because it's the way that we've always done it doesn't mean that it's the best way. So that's proving to be quite a successful program. And within the first, you know, I don't know, the first 2 weeks of it launching, we'd identified a number of social enterprises that had always been hidden from us, not hidden from us, but we'd not identified them and they'd not made themselves known, who actually provide construction services to the construction industry. So, you know, it's a great success from that point of view, because it's a little bit like Match.com or Uber for the car industry, for the construction industry. You know, that we're identifying the supply and the demand, and we're matching those things together in a very transparent and equitable way. And it removes all of that inside track stuff that Tabatha was talking about at the beginning, really, because it's just, this is the work opportunity. If you have an appetite for it, then just register your interest. So.
Keep joking. I keep telling everyone else to take themselves off mute and then forgetting myself. Rebecca, Harvey, I know you can hear us. Can you just find the link to Work Radar and put it into the chat box? Because I think people might be quite interested in that. And I should also encourage people, we welcome the opportunity to answer people's questions. So please do put them into the chat box. I should have or said that before, so I apologize. I just apologize for that. Is there anything in Canada like a Work Radar, Tabatha, either in its stage in development or is it envisioned? Is there something that people are working on from an Indigenous perspective or a small business supplier perspective that you are aware of?
So I just want to clarify, Work Radar is the postal code where you put in the postal code part?
Mm-hmm. Just try to build that network of suppliers to make them more available. Yeah.
So that is partially the role of CCAB. So we have currently about 600 certified Aboriginal businesses that are part of our marketplace. And in that marketplace, you can go in and search by region in Canada, search by skill. But we're also working as well, developing a map of, so not just our members. So that 600 is Indigenous businesses that are members of CCAB, but across Canada, we've estimated there's about 56,000 Indigenous businesses across Canada. So we're working on a mapping tool that will be public, that's been supported by the Government of Canada, that will show I think we're up to about 20,000 Indigenous businesses and their locations. But we also do specifically for a business, they can come to us and say, I have, I'm building a new postal depot as an example in this region. What are the Indigenous businesses around that region? And we will go through our databases and provide that as a service to private corporations also. But there has been a commitment as of last December to the Federal Minister of Procurement for the federal government to increase their spend to at least 5% with Indigenous businesses. And they're looking at how they're going to be able to do that. So they're looking at the model of Supply Nation in Australia, which is a similar type database. It's more open platform database that corporates and governments use as well. So we're working with other national Indigenous organizations on how we can all collaborate together to help build something similar with the support of the government. But right now there isn't one wholesome list of Indigenous businesses, and that was one of the recommendations out of OECD last year on a report on regional rural economic development and Indigenous communities, is that as national organizations, we all have separate lists and provinces have separate lists, and we really need one cohesive list of businesses and also one consistent definition of what makes an Indigenous business certified as an Indigenous business. That's something that as Indigenous people we need to define. So also working towards that as well.
Tim, do you think that there's an appreciation? Well, how would you describe the skills that are associated with being effective in a procurement contracting sense? And do you think there is an appreciation of the skill that underpins that success? Or do companies just sort of assume that someone is just going to do it because it's just work? Like, do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think fundamental to this area, at least historically, and ongoing, empathy is clearly important. And that is not necessarily a characteristic that you particularly associate with, the typical role of procurement or legal or contract negotiators. They tend to come at life from a much more competitive stance rather than perhaps a cooperative stance. They see that role as protecting the business, protecting the company, which of course is a very valid perspective, but we have to think about that protection, I think, in a much wider context today than perhaps we did in the past. I think a really important point here, Stephanie, is we are living in a very different, very altered world at present, and I think there is wide recognition that wherever we emerge to, it is not going to be the same as it used to be. And one of the elements or manifestations of that, after the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, many industries saw an erosion of their potential supply base by as much as 30 to 35%. Certainly in public procurement, we recently, 2018, actually initiated by the Canadian government, did a multi-jurisdictional benchmark called public procurement. And we found that virtually every jurisdiction was reporting a steady decline in the number of organizations bidding for public procurement contracts. That is due to accelerate dramatically as we emerge from COVID. Obviously, everybody is talking about the impacts on supply choice. So on one level, we've got procurement organizations saying, oh, we need to multiply our sources of supply. We've got to de-risk our supply chain by having more alternatives, yet not facing the reality that actually, at least in terms of traditional sources of supply, they're going to see a pretty dramatic reduction. Many people forecasting as much as 40% when all of these support measures are withdrawn. We're going to see significant consolidation of suppliers, and we're going to see, of course, quite significant numbers going out of business. For example, in June, in the US, the bankruptcy rate year on year was up 43%. That's pretty dramatic. And that was June, while there was still a lot of support measures being put in place by the government. So social procurement, social acquisition is actually going to be an essential element. And I think many governments are appreciating the fact that they need to be more focused on how do they support local business, how do they create those supply alternatives of the future. So if you like, the momentum is on our side collectively for those of us who care about social contracting and social value. Now is a tremendous moment to be able to try and push that forward. I do think that the conversation we were just having about standards is an important one. And again, as you, I think, know, Stephanie, we're leading an international working group covering a significant number of jurisdictions at the moment, looking at good practice in social value and social value contracting. It's attracted a whole assembly of individuals from government and private sector and from consultancies. And our goal, at least in this phase of what we're doing, is to assimilate the good, successful practices and look at how we can document and replicate those more. Many of the social value organizations, for example, in Australia, are complaining about the fact that the rules, the practices are inconsistent as they go from one sort of district municipal council to perhaps a county council to perhaps the federal government. You know, there's just no consistency of rule or practice, which again, for a social value institution adds to cost, complexity, risk, etc. So I think moving this whole debate up a notch, a significant notch, is not only socially important, but it's actually become economically essential.
Louise, are you finding that is better understood in your industry and perhaps a different conversation within your company about the essential nature of thinking about supplier capacity building and the diversity that Tim was just talking about?
I think it's really, really interesting, very insightful what Tim was just saying. You know, for this is Louise Townsend talking, not necessarily Morgan Sindall, but for me, you know, the purpose of a contract is to allocate risk somewhere and protect yourself from that risk. And actually, if you change the risk, then it makes it a completely different conversation. So if you stop talking about, you know, how much money you're going to save, and if you do this one way, then there's more risk because it's going to create this kind of output, and that will create cost. So it's all cost associated risk. Actually, if you started talking about things like, if we don't do this way, then, you know, then the planet is going to die, or this part of society is not going to be included, then it changes the whole conversation around what the contents of that contract should look like and how the project should get delivered. And you know, that really, what's quite encouraging is that there's certainly in the UK there's a move towards the integration of a capital budget with an operational budget at its very simplest level. So and quite a very simple way of articulating that is that if we build lots of schools, for example, so let's say we're building a school and we put in a design proposal that says to the customer that actually, if they use this design option, then it's going to save them this much money over the 60-year life of the building in terms of operational energy costs. But let's say it's going to save them 30%. But at capital cost, it's going to cost them 3% more or 5% more. Because the two budgets don't talk to each other on the client side, the capital budget manager on the client side will just go with the cheapest option because he doesn't care how much it's going to cost, because his capital budget doesn't talk to his operational budget. So if we can reach a stage through a contract where actually it's about the value of the asset or the value of the service delivery over the life of that service delivery, rather than just saying, okay, we've got a capital cost here and that's never going to talk to the operational cost. And whether that's about energy or whether it's about enriching people's lives and providing them with work opportunity and employment and all the rest of it, those things have a cost to society. If you don't do that, you make a conscious choice to add cost to society, because if, you know, the welfare budget will go up, people, you know, and it's, you know, I'm preaching to the converted, everybody knows what I mean. Whereas if you make a conscious decision to say, okay, we are going to spend this money in a capital way to improve the lives of people for the life of that project, or that asset or that project delivery or that service delivery, then you arrive at a completely different outcome, and you identify a completely different set of risks through that need to be delivered or obviated or managed through the delivery of that project. And I think, you know, that's maybe where we're starting to see a move towards that in the UK a little bit. In certain pockets, we're starting to see that, and you know, it's the biggest statement so far was, again, you know, referencing the government's announcement last week, you know, that inequality and climate change from a social value viewpoint are going to be high on the central government's list of things to be considered in procurement. That's great, huge tick in the box, but actually make sure that you deliver it in the delivery of that contract and hold your contractors to account if they don't deliver it. Because procuring it is one thing, but delivering it is something completely different.
Tabatha, I'll ask you to comment on Louise's remarks in 1 second. The one thing which I just thought was interesting is that, so in Manitoba, for example, I did some work a number of years ago. The Department of Community Service, Housing and Community Services, I believe is the name. They actually deliberately purchase contracting services from social enterprises that are working with people who are hard to employ. And they, on a price comparison basis, they are deliberately paying more for people to paint the walls in apartments that have been vacated and therefore getting prepared to accept new families. And I wonder, are we going to be able to get to a place where that increased cost is actually seen as an investment rather than, so it wouldn't actually be, if you can combine those budgets, maybe at a governmental level, where we're actually seeing as an investment in doing something else rather than a cost that's being placed in a budget that will never be appreciated by another department that is otherwise going to be paying for that person to receive a service in a different form. Tabatha, do you know, in terms of the way that the potential for Indigenous suppliers to participate in the economy and some of these opportunities that are otherwise potentially excluded, is that part of our conversation? And do you think we can get there? Is it an investment rather than just a cost? Yeah.
So I think we're strongly advocating that it isn't an additional cost. So I think that is a bias that we see in corporates and in government, that if I hire an Indigenous business, it's going to be higher risk and it's going to cost more. And if we look at a number of our corporate partners, so Suncor, as an example, has been a real leader in Canada on Indigenous business spend and contracting from Indigenous businesses. And the CEO now, Mark Little, but was the COO at the time, came with us to Parliament and And he said a number of times that he has a number of Indigenous businesses, electricians that are working in the plant on high temperature hydrogen, which is one of the riskiest to work with. And he has said that none of those contractors are a higher cost to him as a business, nor does he feel that they're a higher risk. So I think we need to move to the point of actual equality and really just providing the opportunity, and that it's not a higher cost. But I do think we also need to really push on the social economic side, as Louise said. So if we look at Suncor for an example, so they've set a target to purchase 5% of their spend from Indigenous businesses. Their spend a year is about $15 billion. Last year they spent $750 million with Indigenous businesses, but in 2017 they spent $600 million. And if we look at the income, family income in the communities near Suncor, so in Fort McKay, their average family income is $73,500. So compared to the average income of Alberta in 2017, it's definitely different now. It was about $50,000. So that impact on purchasing from Indigenous businesses and businesses in the territory has a significant impact on the wealth and the equality, and definitely lowers the cost for on the government to support people, and of course also improves the health standards of people when their employment goes up. So I think there is definitely a conversation that we need to be better at telling about the impact on community and on people when we go to diverse suppliers. But I like to say to corporations and to government, we're not asking you to spend any more money. This is money you're already spending. We're just asking you to set aside a portion of that to diverse suppliers, and specifically in our case, to Indigenous businesses. So we're not asking the government to increase their tax dollars spend to support Indigenous businesses or Indigenous communities. We're saying you're already spending this amount of money, set aside a portion of that on Indigenous business, and that is going to in turn improve the lives of Indigenous people. So that's really where we want to be in that discussion.
Louise, yeah, you look like you're going to jump in there.
Well, I was just thinking as we were talking, it's always extraordinary to me that I work for a big corporate. We're a PLC. We've got shareholders to answer to, but I'm also a taxpayer. I'm a taxpayer, and actually everything that I do potentially has an impact on how the money that I give to the taxman is going to get paid. And it's extraordinary to me that, as individuals who, and everybody who pays tax should be aware of this, should be aware of the fact that actually there's a cause and effect to everything that happens. And if procurement is done well and contract delivery is done really well, then over time, there'll be more tax revenue to go around for things that we all care about. And it's quite a big concept maybe for some people to understand, but it's just common sense really, that if you can get more marginalized people into work and reduce our harm to the environment wherever we can, then the world will be a better place. And that to me is the absolute imperative. I don't see that there's any other, there's no other argument to have other than actually we all want to save the planet and we all want everybody's lives to be better. So at whose expense are we going to make the wrong decision? And it's as simple as that for me, really. I just think that you have an opportunity to make a difference, and why wouldn't you choose to make that difference?
If I could just add some thoughts to this, Stephanie. Yes, I think there are some indications of potentially fundamental change in thinking about how we evaluate economies and economic performance, which is in a sense what we're talking about here. The field of relational economics, as opposed to traditional economics, looks at essentially all relationships that are occurring in an economic context. So, for example, it sees things like contracts as boundary objects which represent value transfers. And some of those contracts will be actual, some would be virtual. Under relational economics, you would see, for example, people choosing to do home care delivery as an economic value, because obviously if somebody needs home care, somebody has to provide it. Actually, from an environmental point of view, of course, if you are recognizing the value created by a partner or a relative who lives in that same house, not only is that beneficial to the environment, but it is, of course, freeing up somebody who would otherwise have to provide that service under a contract. Now, all of that sounds a bit abstract, but certainly we are working at the moment with the European Commission on phase 2 of a project which is looking at well, first of all, the European Commission has recognized the fundamental inadequacy of traditional measures of gross domestic product, and the fact that today, with so much commerce being virtual in its nature, so many cross-border flows, etc., that GDP is no longer an active or accurate measure of economic wealth. So the project that they initiated was to measure the European economy as an ecosystem of contracts. Now, when you start to think in that way, you start to look at contracts in a fundamentally different light, because actually, of course, every time we go to a store, we are in contract with that store owner. There isn't a physical piece of paper, but there are certainly rules and regulations that surround our purchase. So certainly looking at new technologies like blockchain, there is the potential through regulation to actually start requiring far greater visibility and transparency of all of the value transactions that are occurring in society, and beginning to measure economic wealth in a very, very different way. Going back to the examples you were giving at the beginning of this conversation that says, you know, there are a lot of activities today which we don't capture, and to obviously Louise's comment about the need to think about budgeting, for example, in a very different way, to look not at sort of input value versus output value, but to look instead at continuum value. So I think there are some optimistic signs, but they may be a bit slower than we want them to be. I think certainly an initiative like that the EU is talking about, we're looking at probably at the minimum 10-year time frame before anything so substantial could really begin to occur.
Louise keeps telling me I don't get out much or enough, because I actually really believe this conversation is fascinating. And I think the people that will not only watch it today, who have watched it today, but who will watch it in the future will absolutely agree. Is there any sort of last word that any of you would like to share about what you think? If you were going to describe the importance of contracting in 2 words, what would they be? What would be the things that you would want people to think about when they were sitting down to get into contract with somebody else, either in a formal sense or in this relational sense that you've just talked about, Tim? What are the 2 things they really need to keep in mind? Louise, you go first. We'll put you in the spot because your brain's not working as well. So I'm usually behind you. Maybe I'll be closer to catching up. I don't know. So.
Well, I think, you know, maybe just finding common ground. You know, on the basis that you're in a contract with somebody must mean that there's some common ground somewhere.
And I think we might even get kicked off because I think another session is going to start. So I have to let you go. Do you have 1 word, Tabatha?
I had 2. I would say social value.
Okay. Tim?
Oh, I'll just say from confusion to clarity.
Okay. You three are so terrific. Thank you very much for sharing your time. And I'm looking forward to connecting with you again.
Thank you.
Bye.